Hey guys, before we kick things off, if you like what you hear today, go ahead and hit the subscribe button to stay up to date with all of our episodes. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, be sure to leave a rating and review to let us know what you think. Okay, who's ready to learn about the Cold War? Privyet, comrades. Welcome back to the Film Nuts podcast. Okay, all right. Sorry. I thought I could do a Russian accent. I guess I can't. But anyway, welcome back to the Film Nuts podcast. I'm your host, Taylor D. Adams. So, how much do you know about your neighbor? What do you think their deal is? Do you think they could be hiding something? Maybe. I'm not raising these questions to get you paranoid, but it is that kind of paranoia and suspicion that fueled the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union for damn near close to half a century. And one show perfectly encapsulated that experience through the lens of a couple of Russian spies posing as an average American family. FX's Emmy-winning drama, The Americans, ran from 2013 to 2018 and is a favorite of today's guest. Joe Giglio is a journalist and ESPN radio personality who was blown away by this show. We talk about the drama of storytelling, sports and television fandom, and the transition between newspaper journalism and radio. We dive deep into why Joe loves The Americans so much, and I can't wait for you guys to listen. Oh, and we also spoil a major part of The Wire's last season, so just a heads up. It goes by real quick, though. So, here's Joe Giglio talking about The Americans on the Film Nuts podcast.
I've been well. I've been learning radio, which you would think, oh man, you've been talking about sports your whole life. You could do this.
Yeah.
It's a little bit more to it than that, and even more than what I was used to at the newspaper. So it's definitely been a learning experience, and then you're doing that obviously through a pandemic. Kind of adds the learning curve in there. But I feel like it's been really rewarding and enjoyable. So I've liked it.
Do you find it easier to talk or to write?
What's funny is I find it easier to write and then talk. So it's almost like I'm writing out my thoughts so that I'm writing them to myself because I'm the person writing it, as opposed to I could read, your script to an episode of one, but I didn't write it. So I process it better when I write it. So for me, it helps me to wake up, write something, and then I'm in a mode where I feel like I have a better handle on what I'm talking about, rather than you just asking me a question and me trying to wing it, if you will.
How has it been going from, I guess, when you're writing articles, it's a one-person conversation. Like you're talking to yourself or talking to an imaginary voice in order to get your thoughts down on paper. How is it having someone to bounce ideas off of in a co-host position?
Well, it helps to have a really good co-host, and he's really in charge. That's Joe Ovius, and he's been in radio for 20 years. So I don't say that in any kind of negative connotation at all, or any jealousy at all. Like he's a pro,
right.
And I am truly still trying to figure all this stuff out. So that part has been just great.
Has it been a year? A little over a year? What is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. It's 13 months now.
Nice. Well, congrats on making it this far.
Yes. Hey, I've been told there are in radio, there are people who've made it less. So I'm happy.
That's awesome. Yeah. Okay. So when we first started discussing what show you might want to talk about on this podcast, we were tossing around a couple ideas. And I remember a conversation we had back when we did Drinking While Interviewing that you mentioned like The Wire and Breaking Bad and Game of Thrones on probably your favorites list. But we ultimately landed today on The Americans. So why did you want to talk about The Americans?
Well, Taylor, I wanted to talk about The Americans because I feel like, A, no one else probably has gone there yet with this particular television show. And B, it hit me as an adult watching almost, I know it wasn't my childhood, but it started in 1980 is when it was set. And there are times, you've watched movies or television shows that have kind of lampooned the 80s. And, crazy costumes or interior that was, over the top. Yeah. And I felt like this show, there's a part of this show that just makes me feel like in Ringwood, New Jersey, in my wood-paneled family room at my parents' house, and I could smell, the fire, and I could feel the cold, and I can remember truly at a young age, I'm 46 now, like I do remember as a kid, we would have drills of you had to go in the hallway in case there was an air raid. And I remember being like, are the Russians like that imminent of a threat to us? Like, is this really going to happen like tomorrow? And particularly after the Olympics boycott in 1980, right? I can still remember that, and I can still remember not it was this distant threat, but it was always out there, and it was that you're never uneasy per se, right, but that there was something out there, and I just feel like this show, The Americans, has done a spectacular job of actually going behind that process and how we thought and how we lived and how truly terrifying we should have been based on this. Obviously is a dramatization, but the show is based on reality. And there were Russians living here and they tried to assimilate into this country, and it doesn't hurt. Keri Russell's spectacular in this show, as I like to joke. I always say, are we sure the Russians lost the Cold War? Because I could have sworn Keri Russell won the Cold War. She's that good in The Americans. And Matthew Rhys is obviously, I didn't know. I believe he's Welsh. I think he's from Wales. And I didn't know that until I heard an interview. It was like going into the last season of The Americans, and then I heard his actual accent. I was like, what?
Isn't that always freaks people out?
Yes. I had no idea. So, because, you're playing a Russian who's playing an American, and he's really from the UK, and you're just like, huh? So he's so, like, the two of them, they could not have done a better job casting the leads in this series.
We could get a lot of money, $3 million for Timoshev, $3 million for us. We just get relocated, take the good life, and be happy.
Are you joking? Is this a joke?
No.
You want to betray our country?
Well, after everything we've done, I don't think it's such a betrayal.
Defecting to America?
America's not so bad. We've been here a long time. What's so bad about it, The electricity works all the time. Food's pretty great. Closet space.
Is that what you care about?
No, I care about everything.
Not the motherland.
I do, but our family comes first.
So kind of you had this, I guess, for lack of a better word, I guess it was nostalgia, but more of a, but would you say it's not necessarily positive nostalgia because it's all based on fear in a way.
Yeah,
right?
but it was also an explanatory nostalgia to me. Like I felt like they were explaining something to me, even though I know it was dramatization. But I'm always been intrigued. So my thing about television shows too, I like to fancy myself a person who can guess what's going to happen. And I can't stand it when I can guess what happens, which is why I do love Breaking Bad and why I did love The Wire. And why I was so disappointed at Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones, I spent more time watching Game of Thrones than any other show. And then that last season was just so disappointing. So that was the one I could have done with you if we wanted to just, you hear me watch or remember a series. But The Americans, universally, they had 6 seasons. The 5th season was like a setup and some people weren't happy with it. I was fine because, again, they were always leading you somewhere. And then the 6th season, like I haven't heard a show so universally praised for how it ended and how they were able to bring it to the finish line the way that they did. And it just so happened to be, a year before Game of Thrones just so spectacularly messed it up. So it truly now part of it again is Keri Russell. I don't want to undersell that. I want to make sure you're clear on how good she is in this. And,
she is phenomenal. Yeah.
And it's weird because I actually have a history degree from NC State. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, there is some nostalgia there. There is also this, like, again, the explanatory part of it to me just felt like, okay, wait, did you start? There's even a part in the first season where Ronald Reagan, they show the clip of Ronald Reagan's assassination attempt. Mm-hmm. And Matthew Rhys, Philip Jennings, his character goes, wait, was that us?
Yeah.
You know, like, and you're like, whoa. You know, so I like all of that type of historical. It's almost like a fan fiction, but it really is, for me, just fascinating.
So what was your first experience with The Americans? Because now, you know, we live in a streaming world. Did you watch it when it first aired, or how did you catch up? Okay.
I watched it as it came out. And I think that's why I enjoyed it so much. And they had a fairly regular schedule. Like, they weren't one of these shows where they gave you, 3 or 4 episodes and took a month off. And I just felt like I was able to consume it and there was a regularity to it. And I've always enjoyed that part of it. Now, I would tell you, I prefer now in 2021, just give me all 12 episodes. I'll watch them. I'll get through them. But I feel like you do process them better when it's once a week. And it does give you something to look forward to. And I can still remember I had a DVR upstairs where we live now. Mm-hmm. And that's where I would just go upstairs, get on the couch, watch it. It's an hour. It was on FX, so there were commercials. You couldn't fast forward through those. But it was... they actually do a really good job, I think, on FX. I'm watching Snowfall right now, which I think is great as well. So I watched it every week and didn't have a chance to binge any of it because I just kept up with it. And I think that's part of it, too, that I enjoyed.
What about, can you recall anything specifically that got you hooked on it? Like, did you watch the pilot and go, yes, I'm sticking with this? Yeah.
Very first episode, they have a chase scene with Fleetwood Mac's Tusk. Mm-hmm. And they're running through DC. And I'm like, okay, this is good. And we're not spoiling anything here. The neighbor is an FBI director. Mm-hmm. It works for the FBI. Mm-hmm. Stan Beeman.
Well, do we have visitors already?
Yeah, this is Stan.
Hey.
Phil Jennings.
How you doing, Stan Beeman?
My wife, Elizabeth Page, Henry.
Hi.
Hi. Hey, Henry.
Hello.
Are those brownies?
Homemade.
Matt? Your mom's a good cook?
Oh. Yes.
Okay.
I should have taken that. Thank you.
Oh, that's a good brownie, huh?
Yeah.
So this is a pretty good neighborhood we moved into, huh?
Wouldn't live anywhere else. Safe, clean, commute to DC is not too bad. Do you work in the city?
I do.
What do you do, Stan?
I'm an FBI agent.
FBI? Wow, what do you catch bank robbers and stuff?
Actually, I work in counterintelligence now.
Counterintelligence? That's against spies, right?
Exactly.
Ooh. Have to make sure I don't do any spying around here.
Oh, you better not. Especially for those Russians.
Oh yeah, they're the worst, right?
Oh, they certainly are, Philip.
And you could tell it's Noah Emmerich.
Yeah.
And he's also really good, but you can tell, like, in the very first episode, he thinks there's something up with the Americans, with his neighbors, Keri Russell, Matthew Rhys. Like, his instinct is these people are not who they say they are. And literally in the first episode, he's in their garage and Philip Jennings is ready to shoot him. And you're like, wait a second, you can't do that in the first after we had everything with Game of Thrones where they kill everybody and you're like, are they going to kill the main character in the first episode?
Yeah.
And so, that's also part of the build of the show is Stan, Noah Emmerich's character just being tortured and mentally torturing himself, knowing that he was right and that his wife at the time was like, oh, you're being paranoid, give it up. They're just these random people who moved in.
Yeah.
And they wove so many different arcs and so many different plots together and built on them as the years went along that I have a lot of appreciation for that as well.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, this might be an out there question, but do you think there may be some kind of connection between members of the press like yourself and your colleagues reporting on the dramatic nature of sports and kind of this, what it seems, a pretty broad affinity in that industry for these intricate, multi-layered TV dramas?
Probably. Like, I feel like you want to, again, I feel like I want to try to solve the problem, right? Like, I don't want a game with a score and a beginning and even an ending. I don't want a clock. I want you to tell me a story, and I want to be able to try to figure out what's going to happen. And I think you're right. I think there is something to that, because in your work, yeah, you know, you go to a game and you write what happens, and that's that, right? I mean, with this, it's more of, how are you going to trick me? How are you going to surprise me? How are you going to make me think? And I think there is. And how do you pull it all together? Because basically as a writer, you're a storyteller, right? I mean, it's just a different way of delivering, a different medium of delivering, and in shorter doses, obviously. But I think there is definitely an appreciation for the shows that are able to build characters, build plots, intertwine the plots, and then deliver, you know, not just, oh, hey, I've seen that already, or, oh, yeah, that's, you know, Shakespeare. No, this was completely different.
Was there a moment for you being a writer? I mean, was there a moment when you pivoted from, like, I'm writing because I'm reporting on something, to writing and let me tell a story about what I'm observing?
Yeah, I think so. I think as you get older, so I worked at the paper for 4 years. And I think as you get a little bit older, you do realize, like, oh, I don't feel like just going to this game and writing about what happened in this game. I feel like telling a bigger story. I feel like, you know, trying to share or explain something or put into context. I've always felt like that was my strength, was to put something in context for fans. And, you know, I think there comes a point where you realize, I don't want to just go to the game. You know, one of the great unintentional compliments I ever got from Mark Gottfried was, you know, when after a game, I know pretty much there's going to be 10 stories and 9 of them are going to be about the same. I could usually guess what they are. He's like, I never know what you're going to do. I never know what you're going to write.
Is that a goal for you
It's always different.
Is that a goal for you to try and to approach it from that TV writing perspective? Is you want to keep your audience guessing about where you're going next?
No, I think it's just more of, I've always been a very honest person, so I've always wanted to make sure that I am being honest with the reader. And if I always tell people, you confuse, it's not that I dislike your team, it's that I don't love your team the same way that you love your team. And when you love something, typically you love it unconditionally and you tolerate their flaws, where I can point out their flaws. I don't have an issue pointing out the flaws. So no, it's never really my goal to be different. It never really has been. I just think it's from being from New Jersey and being exposed to the media in a different way than it is down here. You know, and obviously a lot of that's changing now, but I just feel like that's the way I grew up, and you know, they would hammer the Yankees, they would hammer the Giants, and they had great teams, the Mets, but it was just completely different how they approached things.
Going back to what you were saying about maybe someone from a fan point of view looking at someone's particular writing and not agreeing with it, is there a difference between fans of a team and fans of a TV show? Because you brought up Game of Thrones earlier about the backlash of everybody hating on that. Like, do you think is there a connection there at all, you think?
I don't think there's a difference. I think when you are a fan of something and when you appreciate something, and then quite frankly, you start rooting for something, I think that's how you follow it. You follow the show the same way you would fans. And maybe that's part of it too, Taylor, that I don't really have a team. Like I don't have a team I live and die with. So it's probably why I invest so much in these shows the way that I do. And I read, I'll read Alan Sepinwall and different people online just to say, okay, well, it's kind of like I would hope somebody would read me and say, well, what just happened? Explain it to me in a way that maybe I couldn't just get from watching it. Yeah. And that truly, I think you have a great point there. I think when I start watching these shows, and I don't have a show right now, Snowfall is the only one I have right now. But when I start watching these shows, I really do. I'll read about the writers of the show, the director of the show, the actors, where they came from, how they got here, and really just kind of get all the nooks and crannies of it.
So did you meet your wife while working at the News and Observer, or was it before?
Yes. Yep. She actually got promoted out of the statistics department in December of '94, and I was hired to replace her in the agate department. Okay.
So was there a part of you that enjoyed watching The Americans because it was a husband and wife team?
Oh man, they're so different, obviously.
I mean, yes. As far as the fields of expertise, yes.
But also in how they went about their own particular love story. There's probably something to that. Like I've always appreciated. I've always appreciated when it's not a fairy tale, right? Like one thing I always tell people: the chase. Everybody loves the chase. When you're trying to find somebody and you're courting somebody. Who, and that was Cheers, right? It was Sam and Diane was the chase. Heck, pick any show, and it's always about the chase. It's never really about the payoff. And to your point about the Jennings and their unique ways, there is something to being together and living through the everyday part of it. Like, there's going to come a point in time where the chase isn't there, the courting isn't there. And how do you handle your relationship? How do you handle your marriage? And how do you handle that with somebody who you're working with? The first 5 years with my wife, we basically lived together, woke up, lived together, went to work, came home, wash, rinse, repeat. For like 5 years. And, it's after the first year, you're like, oh, okay. This isn't the same, right, as the first year. But that doesn't mean your love changes. It just means how your daily interactions change. So I think you're onto something there.
Yeah, because I was curious about that because me and my partner just started watching this for this podcast. It'd been on my list for a while, but I just never took that step to try and watch it. So her and I sat down to watch it this week because she's a big Keri Russell fan. And so we started watching it, and she doesn't normally like very intense or dramatic shows, but she's into this one, and it's cool for us to watch it together. Like we basically do like probably one episode a night kind of thing. So it's really cool to watch it with your partner or with your spouse, because we're looking at how they deal with one another. And granted, there's a whole lot of gray area with their relationship. It's like, what is this based on? Like what, is this love of the motherland, love of each other? Like, where are we dealing with this? I just thought that was an interesting thing to look at. Cause I started thinking about other things that exist about husband and wife teams. I mean, you think of the first thing that came to mind was all the iterations of Mr. and Miss Smith, where it's like they're two spies and they work together and they're married and stuff like that. But their relationship is so much different than the one in The Americans, because it's not that fairy tale. It's a little more tough. They're going through struggles themselves with every episode, as opposed to trying to solve one problem inside of 90 minutes.
Yeah, and that's actually one thing they did really well over the course of the series. In the first 2 seasons, you're like, these two people don't even like each other. You know, you're like, they're out here sleeping around with anybody who'll move. And you're like, that's not a marriage. That's weird. And then as they progress, you get a better idea of how they came together and kind of how they were trained. And then you realize that, or they realize that, wait a second, I actually do have an affection for this person and an appreciation of everything that we've been through.
What are you talking about?
Would you go with her?
Are you crazy? Martha and I...
I'd understand.
It is not like that at all.
It's different. I know.
Yes.
You should get her that ice before it melts.
I love you. I'll be home in a few hours.
And then there's also this idea of getting to the end of the tunnel, right? Like, they realize that they don't want to do this anymore. It's not what they want. And you can understand that by the end of the 80s, how much the politics had changed, how much the relationships had changed between the two countries, and also kind of this idea that, well, is communism working? Is what, and I think they get into that in those later episodes, where those later seasons, where you're like, you start to wonder, well, what the heck am I killing these people in back alleys and, you know, making them choke on grain and cutting them up and putting them in a suitcase and all of the other crazy things that they had to do.
Yeah.
You wonder if the juice really is worth the squeeze.
Yeah. And they start that from, I mean, the beginning too. Like in the first 1 or 2 episodes, Matthew Rhys is questioning why they're doing this, and should they, you know, turn state's evidence or whatever. Like there's that's why that pilot was so good. It's so tight. Like there's so much in there, and it all serves a purpose. But yeah, I was in it from the moment they were playing Tusk, and then a back alley knife fight breaks out, because I didn't expect a whole lot of action. I don't know what, I just thought this would be like more of a slow burn, like non-violent spy thriller, but incorporating the action in the very first episode, I was like, oh, this is not what I expected. I am definitely here for this.
Yeah, and I just think they did such a good job casting, you know, like you've watched shows before, you were like, oh, it was pretty good, you know, but I think when you really hit a home run the way that they did with all of the different, you know, poor Martha. I don't know if you've gotten to the point where Martha, the secretary from the FBI building, becomes involved with Philip. And then you think about like 2 or 3 seasons into her, and you're like, gosh, she's really good too. So it's just like, how are they doing this? And there's a little bit of, oh, I know who that is too. You know, when Margot Martindale and Frank Langella, you know, the Russian operatives, where you're like, oh, okay. So I think that part is, it's just, they did really well with it. And that's Joe Weisberg, who that's his background was either CIA or FBI. I can't remember which one it was, but yeah, his background itself is fairly fascinating as well.
Oh, I didn't know that. I did look up like writing credits for him, but that's really cool to know that he actually had this background in the field that they're doing. Yeah, I know he worked on Falling Skies and Damages, which I've seen Damages.
I'm pretty sure he was the one that was involved in it because it was...
Because that's one thing too, is I think a lot of people attempt to do this spy genre. Yeah. And a lot of them don't bother to go the extra mile of getting people that like maybe consult on stuff. I mean, I think of shows that involve spies like Chuck, the more recent ones, Chuck and Burn Notice, shows like that. They had spy consultants on staff, and they'd be like, this is how I would rig a bomb with 5 materials, like how the MacGyver stuff.
Yeah, he worked in the Joe Weisberg worked in the CIA for 3 years. He went to Yale and worked in the CIA for 3 years. Yeah, I knew there was and it was 87 through 90, so it was right at the end of the Cold War there. So
That is crazy to go from that and be like, yeah, I'm going to be a TV writer. And then my fourth attempt at a show will be this. It's kind of wild. So there's a lot I've seen probably more recently on Twitter and Instagram. There are these polls going about like the best show ever or whatever. And they're because Snowfall has gotten really good for a lot of people, and they're including that and they're trying to figure out, okay, is this better than The Wire? Is it better than Sopranos? Is it all this other stuff? But what to you is a well-written show? Like, is there a checklist, or how does that work, do you think?
There probably is a checklist of how well do you develop characters? How well do you keep the plots? You know, with The Wire, the tagline was everything's connected. And it's true. And then you realize it in the different seasons that they have and how the different parts are intertwined. And I believe when you can give depth to characters, develop those characters, like I said about, Philip's marriage and how you can show how their relationship changed and how their feelings for each other changed. And it's not just this, prop them up and knock them up and set them down. There's depth to it. The neighbor, on the FBI agent on the first episode, having this inclination that these two are up to something and somehow betraying his own instincts. I think, putting characters in situations where they're not perfect, right? Where, I think we have a tendency to want our leading characters to be, there's obviously been a change in this since Tony Soprano would probably be the first one, and Don Draper, and you see like these characters are bad, right? You're like, these are not good people. Like, why am I rooting for the bad guy? But I think at some point you have to have something redeemable happen. Breaking Bad's a great example. I went through the first 3 seasons of Breaking Bad, and I'm like, there isn't a redeemable character on this program. Like, what am I doing?
Yeah.
And then they were able to weave such a tight story that you're like, they got me. They got me. And I also think, and obviously most people work backwards, right? You know the ending and you work from there. The Americans and Breaking Bad are just 2 examples to me, of shows that had a great ending, led you to that ending, and it was plausible and a plausible ending, as opposed to Game of Thrones or even The Wire. How The Wire ended. Yes, spoilers. Omar gets killed, and you're like, that's the life he lived.
Yeah,
but he was also like this super character for so long. So I think the way that they had this show end, to me, was plausible, and you were also sitting here thinking they became such good friends with Stan. The Jennings became such good friends with Stan that you there was just no way you could think that Stan was going to kill them. Or I kind of thought he might let them go, but the way that he did was kind of like, all right, well, I'll save face. You just won't be here anymore.
You were my best friend.
You were mine, too. I never wanted to lie to you. Stan, what else could I do? You moved in next to me. I was terrified. And then we ended up as friends.
Friends. You made my life a joke.
You were my only friend in my whole shitty life. For all these years, my life was the joke, not yours.
And then take care of the kid. That part of it was the son. It was whatever, but it also showed that the connection that he had with the family.
This might sound like a dumb question, but why do, no matter how good a show might be throughout its run, why do we only, when I say we, I just mean viewers, like why do we only remember the quality of something when it ends well?
I think it is because there is a control over it, right? It's not a game. You can control the outcome. And I think when you don't have the right endpoint, it does feel like, well, you've been leading me, Game of Thrones, it feels like you've been leading me down this path and then you don't deliver, Mm-hmm. And I think if you go back and watch the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones, like every season could have been its own kind of self-contained entity in the way that it was. Each season you were like, damn, that was good. And damn, I didn't know where that was going. But damn, they brought it home. Yeah. And then for them to just finish the way that it did, for obvious reasons. And then, like I said, people with the Americans in the 5th season were like, there's a lot of stalling. Nothing really happened in this season. Part of the problem with the Americans was they didn't know if it was going to be renewed. Yeah. And each year it would go and you go. It kind of like The Wire too. Like, oh man, they thought it was going to end in, before the year that it ended. Mm-hmm. And I think with the Americans, they got through the first 3 seasons and they're like, well, I don't know if we're bringing this back. And then once they came back, they knew they were doing 2 seasons. So it's I didn't have a problem with the 5th season, but it was slower. Mm-hmm. There was less to it, but it was also more developing towards getting Paige and, getting their daughter involved in the family business, if you will. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's the trouble when, if a show doesn't know they're going to be renewed, they're like, do we try and end it? Do we not and hang on for dear life? Do we try to find something that maybe some kind of happy middle ground? It's tough.
And I think that's what happened with The Wire, is I think they thought it was going to end in season 4 and then brought the other one back and just kind of didn't quite have the same tightness that they did in that 4th season, which, talk about emotionally devastating television. Oh my gosh. Mm-hmm. The 4th season of The Wire will just break you up. I mean, if you have a pulse, you're going to be crushed by the end of it.
Yeah. Well, Joe, this has been great, man. Thanks for jumping on and talking about this with me.
Absolutely.
That was fun. Huge thanks to Joe for finding time in his schedule for us to talk about The Americans. It's crazy how passionate we get about the stories we love. We each have our own connections to them, and in turn, we all expect different things from these stories. Whether it's our need to be constantly surprised, our desire for our favorite characters to reach their goals, or our innate craving for connection with events from our past. We think of the stories we see as belonging to us, as ours, and we think that what's best for us is best for the story, and vice versa. But it can't always be that way, can it? I mean, where's the drama in all that? What do you guys think? Let me know by reaching out on Twitter at FilmNutsPodcast or email hello@filmnutspodcast.com. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date on all of our episodes and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts to let us know what you think. Anyway, thanks again so much for listening today. Until next time, do svidaniya.